Hey guys, me here. Really quickly before we get started, do you want free Darkly Speaking merch? Well, throughout the month of February and until February 28th, I will be giving out free premium holographic Darkly Speaking stickers to every listener who rates the podcast 5 stars on whatever podcast app you're listening to. All you have to do is send me a screenshot of your rating to darklyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com, or feel free to DM me on Instagram and TikTok at darklyspeakingpodcast. And of course, don't forget to leave the best mailing address for you so I can send you your free Darkly Speaking merch. Thank you all so much for being here, and back to the show. In November of 1943, an experienced 37-year-old hunter named Carl Herrick vanished while tracking game in the wilderness near Glastonbury Mountain. For 3 days, there was no sign of him, only forest, cold air, and unanswered questions, until his body was discovered. Herrick had been squeezed with such force that his ribs were broken and his lungs punctured, an ending as violent as it was difficult to explain. Almost exactly 2 years later, a 74-year-old lifelong hunter named Middie disappeared near Bickford Hollow, not far from where Herrick had been found. Despite extensive searching, the only trace ever recovered was a single blue handkerchief, left behind in terrain he knew well. The following year, an 18-year-old college student named Paula Weldon set out on a hike and was last seen walking into that same stretch of land. After she disappeared, no trace of her path was ever found, and no body was ever recovered. She simply vanished. Then, 3 years to the day after Paula vanished, in 1949, a 68-year-old World War I veteran named James Tedford stepped off a bus while traveling back to Bennington and was never seen again. Within a year, an 8-year-old boy named Paul Jepson disappeared from a town dump in Bennington in a narrow window of time while his parents were working nearby. And finally, in 1951, the body of 53-year-old Frieda was recovered, months after she went missing, in an area that had already been searched extensively. 6 people, spanning different ages, lives, and circumstances, vanished or died within the general vicinity of Glastonbury Mountain, all between the months of October and December. Taken together, this cluster of disappearances and the growing number of strange reports tied to the forested stretch of the Appalachian region would eventually give rise to a name: the Bennington Triangle. Welcome back to an all-new episode of Darkly Speaking, and the very first episode of 2026. My name is Alex Kern, and if you're joining us for the first time, well, you found your way to a very dark podcast. Every Monday, I release new episodes on chilling and unsettling stories from the world of true crime to the eerie realms of the paranormal. I also release video episodes every week on Spotify and YouTube. Now, as I mentioned, this is a very dark podcast, and tonight, we're talking about a place long associated with unexplained vanishings, violent deaths, and strange phenomena. It's a region tied to stories of time slips, interdimensional portals, UFO sightings, and cryptid encounters, murders, disappearances, stories that resist neat explanations. Since there is so much to uncover and so many stories to talk about, we'll be splitting this into a 2-part series. In part 1, which is today's episode, we're going back to where all of this begins, the history of the region, the indigenous knowledge that shaped how this land was understood long before it was named, and the series of strange and unexplained disappearances that eventually drew out national attention and gave the region its identity. But the region has also been tied to stories of time slips, portals, strange lights appearing in the sky, murderers, and encounters with cryptid-like creatures moving through the forest. So, in part 2, we cross into the other side of the story, into the phenomena that have gathered around this landscape over time, the explanations people reach for when ordinary answers seem to fail. So, lace up your hiking boots and grab your parka, because we're stepping into the vast wilderness of southwestern Vermont, into the dense, dark, cold forests of the Bennington Triangle. There is a stretch of land in southwestern Vermont where the forest grows tall and close together, where ridgelines fold into one another and narrow streams cut quietly through the ground. The trees here are old, rooted in some of the oldest rock formations in the world, part of the ancient spine of the Appalachian Mountains. Water here moves constantly, over stone, through low valleys, but much of the sound never carries far. It's a landscape that muffles sound, bends a sense of distance, and has a way of making direction feel unreliable. You don't cross into this place all at once. There are no markers, no posted boundaries to announce that you've arrived. Roads narrow, towns thin out. The forest presses closer to the shoulders of the pavement until the built world begins to feel temporary, like something that could be swallowed if left alone for too long. What eventually came to be called the Bennington Triangle is not a neatly defined region, but a convergence, a broad area shaped by isolation, terrain, and unexplained phenomena. Geographically, it sits in the far southwestern corner of Vermont, pressed against the borders of New York and Massachusetts. The area itself spans roughly 100 square miles of mountainous forest centered on Glastonbury Mountain, deep within the Green Mountain National Forest. The mountain itself rises to 3,747 feet. Its slopes steep and uneven, its interior cut through by ravines and thick woods that stretch uninterrupted for miles. Nestled within this terrain are the remains of the old ghost town of Glastonbury, once a small logging community now nearly empty, a place where human presence never quite held. This isn't open wilderness in the way people expect it to be. The forest tightens gradually, narrowing space and muting sound until footsteps feel closer than they should and voices fail to carry as expected. Trails can appear clear for a time, then fade under leaves, snow, fog, or shadow, and distance becomes unreliable. What looks like a short walk can stretch far longer once elevation begins to shift beneath your feet. The climate is unpredictable at times. Cold dominates much of the year, and in late fall and winter, darkness settles in quickly, with fog sinking low between the trees and snow arriving early, sometimes lingering for months. Weather moves through the mountains without much warning, changing conditions fast enough to disorient even those who know the terrain well, leaving little margin for error. It was within this environment that the area's reputation began to take shape. People entered this landscape and did not return or vanished in ways that were never fully explained, leaving behind only gaps and unanswered questions. Over time, those disappearances became the quiet center of the story, the events that would later be gathered under the name Bennington Triangle. Only later did other accounts begin to gather around the disappearances. People spoke of strange lights appearing above the trees, of moments where time seemed to slip while moving through the woods, of shadowy figures glimpsed between trunks or at the edges of sight, sometimes described as monstrous, sometimes never clearly seen at all, and even of openings or portals that felt out of place in the landscape. These accounts didn't create the unease surrounding the region. They took root in a place where unease was already present. And that unease didn't begin in the 20th century. No, long before disappearances entered public record, the land itself carried warnings. Its reputation was already embedded in the geography and the way people spoke about it, passed down through generations. That story begins much, much earlier in the history and indigenous lore that shaped this landscape, long before anyone thought to give it a name. Long before the region had a name and long before it appeared on any map, the land already carried a reputation. The unease tied to it didn't arrive with settlers, nor did it begin when people later started to disappear. It existed earlier, passed down through indigenous knowledge shaped by generations of living alongside the land rather than by symbolism or myth. For the indigenous people of the region, including the Abenaki, part of the larger Algonquian nation, this was not simply difficult terrain or an unlucky stretch of forest. It was understood as land set apart, a place avoided entirely and entered only for burial. It was considered ground meant for the dead, not the living, and not somewhere a person was meant to remain or return from unchanged. Accounts tied to the land describe it as uninhabitable to humans, not because of predators or harsh ground alone, but because of forces believed to exist there. The danger was not framed as violence so much as incompatibility. People did not belong in that place, and the land was not expected to accommodate them. One explanation passed down through indigenous lore holds that this region is where the spirits of the four winds, north, south, east, and west, come together in the same space. Rather than settling into balance, these winds were colliding, shaping harsh and unstable conditions across the land. Outside of legend, the environment reflects that same instability. Winds shift without warning, storms roll in quickly, and weather patterns change abruptly, producing conditions that can confuse even those accustomed to moving through the harsh terrain. The landscape itself reinforces that confusion because plant growth follows prevailing winds. Irregular wind patterns cause trees and undergrowth to grow at unusual angles and in conflicting directions. Over time, the forest loses visual consistency and the terrain becomes harder to read even for experienced travelers. In this setting, disorientation can become inevitable. Landmarks become unreliable, distance grows difficult to judge, and losing one's way can happen suddenly. Among the most literal pieces of indigenous folklore associated with the region is the story of what has come to be known as the man-eating stone, a rock said to consume those who step onto it, swallowing them whole. The story is consistent with the broader belief that the land takes people and does not easily give them back. In the mid-1700s, European settlers moved into the area and indigenous warnings were largely ignored. Logging operations were established, large-scale deforestation followed, and towns were built to support industry, including Glastonbury and Bennington. Permanent human presence took hold in a place long understood as unsuitable for it. Over time, those towns would give the region its modern reference points. As settlements expanded and industry continued, unsettling reports began to circulate, not immediately framed as supernatural, but noted quietly as disappearances and incidents that couldn't be explained. Those reports accumulated slowly, and at the time, they weren't treated as a legend, just scattered observations of people vanishing in ways that didn't quite fit with what was known about the land. In 1992, local historian and author Joseph A. Citro discussed the region during a radio interview and suggested that the disappearances might share a common explanation tied to the land itself. He proposed that what had been happening there was connected to the place rather than typical external factors. Citro later coined the term Bennington Triangle, drawing a comparison to the Bermuda Triangle and framing the area as a focal point for unexplained phenomena. The name did not create the mystery so much as give shape to something people were already struggling to understand. Citro also pointed to strange occurrences beyond disappearances, suggesting that missing persons were not the full story. Those elements extend beyond this segment, but they help explain why the name took hold. The land's reputation did not begin with the disappearances, and the disappearances did not create the legend. Long before anyone tried to define it, something about this place had already gone wrong, and in the decades that followed, people would begin to vanish within it. It's December 1st, 1946, an early winter day in Vermont, with cold air that stays in your lungs and a sunset that comes too soon. At Bennington College, the campus is moving toward finals, and that pressure sits quietly on everyone, including 18-year-old sophomore Paula Weldon. Around lunchtime, she tells her friend Elizabeth that she plans to take a short hike, just something to break the day open and clear her head. And for Paula, that isn't unusual at all. Hiking and being outdoors are part of her normal life here. So that afternoon, she leaves Dewey Hall in a red parka and thick-soled sneakers, the light already dimming as she steps out into the cold New England air. That evening, Paula doesn't come back, and the following morning, she still hasn't returned. When she also fails to appear for classes, it becomes clear that she never signed out the previous afternoon when she left campus, an unusual lapse for her, and the absence is recognized almost immediately as out of character. College administrators and Paula's friends quickly understand that something is very wrong. By Monday, around midday, admissions director Mary Garrett is already reaching beyond campus, reaching out to the state's attorney, William Travers Jerome Jr., because the response isn't as straightforward as it might be today. You see, Vermont doesn't have a formal state police force at this time. Bennington College is known to be a safe women's school, and the Weldon family is high profile, which means organizing a search to this degree requires coordination that doesn't fit neatly into any routine. The first ground search is led by a local farmer, Henry Steele, moving south of campus with college staff and local volunteers. They push through thick brush and uneven ground toward Everett Cave, near the base of nearby Mount Anthony, in part because Paula had mentioned wanting to visit the cave. They search through the afternoon, pushing as long as daylight allows, but nothing turns up, and after hours of searching the trails around the cavern, they don't find any sign that Paula had ever been there. No clothing, no footprints, no sign that she had ever wandered off the trail or had been injured nearby. As darkness falls, the search is forced to stop. By Monday evening, with the daylight search yielding nothing, Paula's description goes out over the radio, carrying her story beyond campus and the town. And even as darkness settles over the same slope south of campus, Paula's friends break into small groups and keep searching on their own, moving through the steep, tangled terrain around Mount Anthony and into the dense Makula woods, where the trees press close and the ground drops unevenly underfoot, trying to reach areas around Bennington that official efforts can't cover fast enough. By Tuesday, December 3rd, witness sightings begin to draw focus back toward the mountain. You see, local farmers report seeing a girl matching Paula's description around 4:30 p.m. on Sunday, heading up the long trail, now a part of the Appalachian Trail, toward Glastonbury Mountain, a stretch of terrain that soon becomes the primary geographic focus, drawing roughly 300 college students into the search. That same day, the Bennington Evening Banner reports her disappearance, and by Wednesday, her photograph is moving steadily outward, circulating throughout New England. As reports continue to place Paula on the mountain, her father arrives from Stanford and works closely with Bennington College president Lewis Jones, actively gathering information and pressing for clarity as the search widens. At the same time, attention begins to drift away from the mountain when a cab driver reports giving a college student a ride, a detail that briefly reframes a search. If Paula reached the bus station, she could have boarded buses to Pittsfield, New York, or Burlington, and the possibility raises the question of whether she was ever lost in the woods at all. With that possibility fading, attention turns back inward, toward explanations closer to home. Investigators consider whether Paula may have suffered an accident while hiking, and amnesia is raised as another possibility. Though her father quickly rejects it, noting she has no history of head injury and no mental illness beyond mild seasonal depression. Running away is dismissed just as quickly, with no belongings missing, no clear motive, and no evidence that she planned to leave at all. When investigators struggle to settle on an explanation, attention shifts to a rumor involving a boy at Williams College. Her father dismisses it, explaining that they were only social acquaintances and that there was no romantic attachment. A view Paula's friends echo when they say she wasn't seriously interested in any of the boys. Furthermore, the students at Williams College couldn't offer any useful information. More time passes with no answers. The case begins to loosen its grip on Vermont, and out-of-state sightings start to multiply, pulling the investigation briefly into Massachusetts. Sightings in local newspapers place Paula in Boston. A New Haven Railroad employee claims to see her on a train in Springfield, Massachusetts. In Fall River, a waitress reports serving a young woman she believed to be Paula at the Modern restaurant late Monday evening at around 9:30 p.m. and says she was accompanied by a man in his mid-20s, heavy-set, about 5'8", who appeared intoxicated and abusive. According to the waitress, Paula asked how far Fall River was from Bennington and how she might get back, and said she had arrived with $1,000 but now had no money left. The report draws in the Massachusetts State Troopers and the Fall River Police. There is corroboration that supports this account, though it's pretty strange. A clothing store manager named John Proud reports selling clothing to 3 men, one of whom matched the general description of the man seen at the Modern restaurant and claimed to be a photography student from New Haven, saying they planned to hike that weekend. The timeline could theoretically place them in Vermont, but the overall story feels inconsistent. As the investigation stretches outward, State's Attorney Jerome draws it back toward the mountain, convinced that the strongest leads still point there. At least 6 witnesses place Paula on the long trail Sunday afternoon, and Jerome maintains that these sightings occurred after the reported cab ride, reinforcing Glastonbury Mountain as the last place she was reliably seen. That route appears again in a key account from contractor Louis Snap, who reports picking up a hitchhiker matching Paula near Bennington College just before 3 p.m. His description aligns closely, aside from a discrepancy in the parka color she was wearing, later attributed to his colorblindness. Knapp recalls that Paula was quiet, asked whether the road led toward Route 9, and said she was trying to reach the long trail. He drops her near Furnace Bridge, and within minutes, she's gone from view. Additional accounts trace the same path. You see, night watchman Ernie Whitman reports meeting Paula in Woodford Hollow at around 4 p.m., where she asked for directions to the long trail. 3 others say that they saw her cross a bridge that led only to that trail, and additional residents report seeing her near the F.A. Fuller camp shelter. By Thursday, December 4th, the search reaches its peak, with students, faculty, locals, State Guard members, and aircraft converging on the same mountain at once. By Friday, December 6th, the direction of the search changes. The mountain search is called off, a national police broadcast goes out, and the focus shifts toward foul play. Investigators point to a growing set of possibilities. The Fall River report, sightings of a maroon car with Connecticut plates carrying a man and a young woman matching Paula's description in Woodford Hollow west of the Long Trail, and reports of a small truck traveling a mountain road near where Paula was last seen. Even as the mountain search is abandoned, authorities acknowledge that there is no evidence of foul play on the mountain itself. Still, without a theory of foul play, the investigation can't be sustained, and detectives lack the authority to keep pressing forward. That limitation pushes the case outward instead, drawing in Connecticut authorities as investigators follow whatever leads remain. One report centers on a blue coupe owned by a man named John Bush after witnesses claim to have seen him with a woman resembling Paula riding in the passenger seat. Bush is found to have been in the Bennington area at the time Paula went missing, and it emerges that he had told several people that he had a date with a beautiful blonde. The lead is examined and then quietly fades. Nearly 2 weeks after the mountain search is called off, on December 20th, a couple discovers small sneaker prints in the snow off a roadway along Route 9, consistent with the type of shoes Paula was wearing when she disappeared. The tracks can be followed for several hundred yards before they stop abruptly, as if she had stepped into a vehicle or simply disappeared at that point. A separate report comes from a woman living near the route who says she noticed similar tracks behind her house, lending weight to the idea that Paula may have wandered, but there is still no body. As the weeks pass, the investigation begins to lose momentum. The holidays arrive and slow progress. New Governor Ernest Gibson orders a review. The reward is increased, posters are printed, and Connecticut detectives return to assist once more, but nothing comes of it. Then, in December of 1947, a woman is detained in South Carolina after using names connected to Paula's case. For a brief moment, attention returns to her case. She resembles Paula very closely, but the differences are enough. Brown eyes, a southern accent, and Paula's mother ultimately rejects the identification. The case ends unresolved. No remains are recovered, no suspect is confirmed, and there's still no definitive explanation as to what happened to her. Paula Weldon disappears completely and is never found. Her disappearance becomes the most remembered, the case most closely tied to this region. But it is neither the only one nor the first. Paula Weldon was one among several who vanished here, and by the time she disappeared, others had already come before her. Late November settles hard over southern Vermont, and the snow is already deep enough to slow every step and blur what should still be clear. Forrest Hewitt moves through it carefully, trudging through several feet of snow, searching for anything that might tell him where his cousin Carl Herrick went. The cold has already done its work. Whatever sign Carl left behind has been pressed flat by wind and snowfall, blurred at the edges until it no longer points anywhere at all. The last clear set of Carl's tracks had crossed a remote forest road days earlier, only to be wiped away by passing plows, leaving nothing solid to follow. Carl has been missing for 3 days now, and in that stretch of white silence, the snow makes time settle in, heavier and harder to read. Forrest keeps his eyes on the ground as he moves through the woods, the quiet broken only by the cold wind and the thin sound of mourning birds, and with each step, the hope of finding his cousin alive slips further out of reach. When the morning light rises, Forrest notices something darker against the vast white expanse ahead of him. At first, it doesn't resolve into a shape, just a break in the snowdrifts. But as he moves closer, the shape begins to take form, then color, until the cap comes into focus, followed by the coat. Faint, gray fabric pressed through the packed snow. Carl lies motionless, and the uncertainty that carried the search this far gives way all at once. Forrest calls the others over, and the search ends there. At first, the explanation for Carl's death seems straightforward enough. With temperatures well below freezing, it makes sense to assume Carl succumbed to the cold. But that idea begins to thin almost as soon as it's considered. You see, Carl was found only about 3 miles from home, moving through terrain he had hunted for nearly all of his 37 years. He was also found exactly where he said he planned to be. And he hadn't simply vanished overnight. He had been gone for days. In the end, the cold by itself doesn't fully explain what lies in front of them. As the group looks over the area around Carl's body, large tracks pressed deep into the surrounding snow begin to stand out. His body bears marks consistent with animal claws, and attention turns towards the most likely animal in these woods, a black bear. The presence of the tracks raises a practical question almost immediately, though. Bears don't typically attack this way, especially not experienced hunters, and not without leaving clearer signs of what happened. Not far from where Carl lies, Forrest spots his rifle propped against a tree roughly 70 feet away. It isn't tangled in brush or half buried in snow, but set there with a kind of intention. When it's examined, one round remains in the magazine and a single spent casing rests nearby in the snow. Taken together, the placement suggests not a struggle carried through the woods, but a single moment that happened exactly where it began. From those details, a rough story is pieced together, though it never quite settles. Carl fires at the bear. Thinking it's down, he sets the rifle aside and moves closer, likely to field dress it. Then the moment breaks. Somewhere between the shot and the approach, the bear rises again. What follows isn't seen or confirmed, only assumed. The animal reaches Carl, and the encounter ends his life. Even as that explanation takes hold, though, what remains at the scene quietly resists it. There is no evidence of a mauling, no sign that an animal attempted to feed, and the bear itself is gone by the time Carl is found. Although there are scratches on his arms, hands, and face, the injuries that killed him are not deep bite wounds or tearing lacerations. Forrest notices one detail, though, that chills him to his core. Carl's face appears darkened, a change that doesn't sit comfortably with the explanation taking shape around them. Days later, the county coroner returns to the body, searching for clarity the scene itself never provided. The autopsy determines the cause of death as internal bleeding, though there is no single catastrophic external wound to explain it, only damage that occurred beneath the surface. The explanation that follows is difficult to sit with. Carl is believed to have been squeezed with enough force to rupture a lung, leading to fatal hemorrhaging. Some reports suggest the bear dropped him, then returned and squeezed him again before leaving the scene. It is an account delivered plainly, not because it satisfies the facts, but because no clearer explanation ever takes its place. But with no clearer alternative, Carl Herrick's death is ultimately recorded as a freak hunting accident, attributed to a fatal lapse in judgment and harsh conditions. On paper, the case is closed. But after it's written off, something strange begins happening. It's November of 1945 in southern Vermont, 2 years after the death of Carl Herrick and a year before Paula Weldon will disappear, long before anyone thinks to give this place a name. Middie Rivers vanishes near Bickford Hollow, roughly 20 miles from West Townsend, within the same stretch of forest and mountain terrain that would later draw an unsettling kind of attention. 74-year-old Middie Rivers moves through the woods of Bickford Hollow with the ease of someone who has spent a lifetime doing exactly this. He has hunted the forests of southern Vermont for decades. He knows the land by feel as much as by sight, understands how the ground rises and folds, how wind cuts its way through the trees, and how quickly weather can turn in late autumn. That morning, he is hunting alongside his son-in-law near Bull's Brook, not far from the ghost town of Glastonbury, in a stretch of forest marked by familiar trails, streams, and landmarks. When they reach a spot locals call the Forks, they part ways, Middie explaining that he intends to go only a short distance and return before lunch. Before separating, his son-in-law offers a quiet caution, asking Middie not to cross the ridge into Bickford Hollow, not because it is especially dangerous, but because it is an area Middie knows less well than the rest of the surrounding forest. Middie takes note, but trusts that his long experience will be enough and continues on alone. By around 3 o'clock that afternoon, Middie has not returned and concern sets in quickly. Family members begin searching the woods right away, calling his name and firing rifles in the hope that sound will carry through the trees. The forest gives no response. Authorities are contacted, and what began as a family search expands into an organized operation overseen by the local fire chief. Within a week, the Vermont State Guard is deployed, followed by a detachment of U.S. Army soldiers, all working within a search area that is limited and thoroughly covered. Even with that level of coordination and manpower, no trace of Middie Rivers turns up. As the search drags on, heavy snowfall begins to settle in over the hollow, softening the ground and closing off what little access remains. By November 20th, the official effort is abandoned, not because anything has been resolved, but because winter has made further searching impossible. A handful of volunteers continue on through the season, their numbers thinning as the snow deepens and the woods fall silent. Several months later, in May of 1946, a woman hiking near the base of Bickford Hollow notices something lying on the ground. She isn't looking for Middie Rivers when she comes across it, and at first, the object seems ordinary enough, a blue handkerchief with a small amount of money wrapped inside. The handkerchief is later positively identified as Middie's, traced by an ink stain matching the specific type used at Benmont Papers where he worked. There is no question that it belonged to Middie Rivers, but what no one can explain is how it came to be there. The handkerchief is found in a populated area, close to roads and homes where several clear routes lead outward from the woods. With so many clear paths leading in and out of the surrounding area, the absence of any further trace is what makes Middie Rivers' disappearance so hard to make sense of. Given Middie's age, investigators briefly consider the possibility of a medical event. But the idea falters almost as soon as it's raised, offering no explanation for how a man could simply vanish from a place so interconnected and frequently passed through. Another explanation circulates more quietly, that Middie may have been accidentally killed by another hunter, his body hidden to avoid the consequences. Yet it remains unsubstantiated, leaving nothing solid enough to pursue and slowly falling away. Middie Rivers is never found, and his disappearance receives only periodic attention before slipping from view. When Paula Weldon vanishes the following year, newspapers briefly look back at Middie's case, noting how close the dates fall, and they do the same thing again after James Tedford disappears 3 years later. By 1949, 3 years to the day after Paula Weldon vanished, the earlier disappearances around Bennington were starting to be mentioned together. James Tedford's case enters that conversation, but it unfolds differently than the others, not deep in the woods or along mountain trails, but in broad daylight as he stepped off a bus surrounded by people. It's the beginning of December of 1949 when World War I veteran James Tedford traveled to St. Albans, Vermont to visit his wife. Tedford was a resident of the Soldiers' Home in Bennington, and though he was married, he lived separately from his wife due to struggles with mental illness that followed James throughout his daily life. The city of St. Albans sat within the same broad region of northwestern Vermont, where other disappearances would later be noted, though there was nothing remarkable about the trip itself. After the visit, he boarded a bus to return to Bennington, riding a familiar route that ran from St. Albans back toward the Soldiers' Home. Other passengers were on board, and nothing about the journey stood out. At the end of that ride, James Tedford calmly steps off the bus before it reaches its destination. After that, Tedford never arrives back at the Soldiers' Home. His absence goes unreported for 7 full days, due to the institution failing to notify authorities sooner. By the time the oversight is recognized, any chance of following a clear trail has already passed. Once authorities are finally informed, a search effort begins, though it lacks the urgency seen in earlier cases. By November 16th, attention has already shifted away from Bennington and toward Brandon, Vermont, where witnesses report seeing a man matching Tedford's description on a main street. He is said to be behaving oddly, but the accounts are vague, inconsistent, and never confirmed. Unlike the disappearances associated with Glastonbury Mountain, there is no wilderness to search here, no deep forest or isolated terrain to explain the loss. The explanation that settles in is a simple one. It is assumed that Tedford exited the bus in the wrong town, either by mistake or by choice, and that no one intervened. No one escorted him to care, no one followed up in time. Neglect rather than mystery becomes the quiet force shaping the outcome. Tedford's mental illness is noted, then folded into the narrative as an unfortunate circumstance rather than a question worth pursuing. Without evidence and without sustained attention, the investigation thins out. No resolution is reached, and the case quietly goes cold and fades into the background. James Tedford's disappearance is pulled back into focus only later, after other cases draw renewed attention to the Bennington region. His name resurfaces because it becomes part of the story people only begin to notice in retrospect. Within a year, another disappearance follows. This one involving a child who disappears in broad daylight in the middle of town. It's an ordinary, crisp autumn day in October of 1950. 8-year-old Paul Jepson sits in the cab of his parents' truck at the Bennington town dump while his mother tends to her work nearby, caring for the pigs kept on the property. The dump itself is an active work site, and Paul's parents work here, responsible for maintaining the grounds and managing roughly 65 pigs. Paul's mother steps away from the truck to tend to the pigs, and she's gone for approximately 30 minutes, a span of time that passes without urgency or concern. When she returns, the cab is empty. Paul is no longer where she left him. As his mother looks in and around the cab, there is no immediate explanation for what has happened. Nothing appears disturbed, and nothing offers even a hint of what might have taken place during that brief window. Authorities are notified quickly, bloodhounds are brought in, and they are able to pick up Paul's scent pretty quickly as well. The dogs follow the trail away from the dump, tracking it through familiar ground until it reaches the intersection of East and Chapel. At that point, the scent stops completely. The trail simply ends. In the absence of answers, theories begin to surface. One suggests abduction by an opportunistic predator, though no evidence ever supports it, and the concept itself is not clearly defined at the time. Another claims Paul may have run away, citing a newspaper reports that he had done so before, though that source cannot later be located or verified. These ideas circulate without settling into any viable conclusions. What never emerges is anything concrete. There is no physical evidence beyond the scent trail, no confirmed witnesses, and Paul Jepson is never found. This string of mysterious disappearances does not end here. Just 16 days later, another person vanishes in a different area, roughly 14 miles away across Glastonbury Mountain, a disappearance that will later give this place its name and become one of the very few to yield a body. By late October, the disappearances had begun to feel uncomfortably close together. Paul Jepson had vanished only weeks earlier, and now attention shifted roughly 14 miles east, still within the shadow of Glastonbury Mountain, still inside the same stretch of southern Vermont. This would be the final disappearance in the Bennington Triangle cluster, though no one could have known that at the time. The leaves were in their final stages of change, thinning out as they fell from the trees. 53-year-old Frieda was moving through the terrain she knew well near her husband's hunting camp, walking alongside her cousin as they picked their way across uneven ground. Fallen leaves crunched softly beneath their boots, and a steady late autumn breeze moved through the woods with a low rushing sound they found calming. It was an ordinary afternoon, familiar and unremarkable in the way so many outings had been before. Later in the day, the weather had turned cold in the way Vermont often does late in the season, with sharp air, damp ground, and daylight that faded sooner than expected. At one point along the trail, Frieda slipped into a narrow brook. The fall itself was minor, but it left her clothes soaked, and with late October temperatures already biting into the afternoon, staying wet wasn't an option. With roughly an hour of daylight left and the woods already dimming, she decided to turn back toward camp to change. Frieda set off alone, separating from her cousin and choosing what she believed would be the shorter route back, expecting to reach camp quickly. But she never returned. When Frieda never arrived back at camp, search efforts began soon after, first by those nearby and then by authorities. Investigators initially believed Frieda may have attempted a shortcut, becoming disoriented and lost her way as darkness closed in. There was no indication of another person involved, no sign of a struggle, no reason to suspect anything beyond a misstep compounded by fading light. Months passed, and in May of 1951, a pair of local fishermen near Somerset Reservoir came across something in the water's edge that did not belong there. The remains were soon identified as Frieda Langer. Her body was severely decomposed and located roughly 3.5 miles from where she was last seen alive, in an area that had already been extensively searched. Because of the conditions of the remains, an official cause of death could not be determined. Investigators noted no signs of violence, and based on what could be assessed, her death was likely attributed to exposure and disorientation. Frieda Langer was one of the few people in the sequence who was ultimately found. Her disappearance did not end in absence, but in recovery, with an explanation that was ordinary and seemingly logical. And yet, her case remains connected to the others, not because of what happened to her, but because of when and where it happened and how closely these disappearances followed one another. With Frieda's recovery, the original disappearances themselves came to an end, but the questions did not. In the years that followed, people searching for language to hold what had happened here would give it a name, the Bennington Triangle, not simply to mark a cluster of vanishings, but to gesture toward something harder to explain, an attempt to make sense of a place where ordinary explanations kept falling short. By the end of this story, 6 names tend to rise to the surface, the disappearances most often cited as the historical core of what would later be called the Bennington Triangle. They involve different ages, different lives, and different circumstances, yet they all unfold within the same stretch of southwestern Vermont during the same narrow window of the year over the span of less than a decade. But those 6 cases are not the full story. They exist within a much larger landscape. Dense forest, ridgelines, hollows, and miles of terrain that even now remain sparsely populated and difficult to search. And within that same corridor, other people vanished as well. In October of 1942, 1 year before Carl Herrick was discovered, 13-year-old Melvin Hills disappeared in the region, years before the name ever existed. 2 years after Paula Weldon vanished, 3 hunters from Massachusetts went missing near the ghost town of Glastonbury, leaving behind no clear answers and no confirmed trail. In total, 10 disappearances and deaths are tied to this corridor in the span of less than a decade. Of those, only 2 bodies were ever recovered, and even then, the causes were never conclusively settled. What remains is not a solved mystery or even a clearly defined one, but a collection of strange vanishings, investigations that stalled, explanations that never fully formed, and records that end without resolution. History can document who vanished, when they were last seen, and where the searches stopped, but it can only take us so far. Because the Bennington Triangle was never just about a number of cases or even the people at the center of them. It's about a place, a stretch of land with a long memory, and the ways people faced with unanswered questions try to make sense of what the record can't explain. And that's where we'll leave off for now. The story continues next week in part 2, where we'll step beyond the timelines and into the other side, the paranormal phenomena, the strange cryptid reports, and the ideas people have used to explain what may be happening in this region, and why the name Bennington Triangle came to mean more than disappearances alone. In the meantime, make sure to follow along on TikTok and Instagram at Darkly Speaking Podcast for your dose of dark and chilling content. And I'll see you next week with a brand new episode.